Hello everyone, thank you for joining today. And so, as it was introduced, we will talk about the mobile end-to-end testing. And so, but first I always like to start with setting up the goal. So you guys have expectations all set, and if you figure that another talk is more interesting, you might also go there too. So our goals are pretty clear. So we will actually talk, as I mentioned, about end-to-end testing on mobile devices. But particularly with focus on two mainstream software frameworks like Robotium and Appium. But ultimately the goal of this talk is for you guys to bring something back to your work, figure out what tool you might use, or even the conceptual approach you might select to apply to your day-to-day job. And so with that, as I've mentioned, it's going to be about mobile end-to-end testing. But first I have to establish what do I mean by that, and why did I select to talk about the mobile. And so obviously there are so many devices, there are wearables, there is a desktop, laptop, you can have mobile device, tablet. And obviously when it comes to testing and development, you think in terms of iOS, Android. If you're a web developer, you would do something with responsive apps, or hybrid if you're using some React Native or React. But for today we will focus just on mobile devices, whether it's a tablet or the mobile phones, with particular focus on Android for the most part, but we'll also talk a little bit about the iOS as well. And so I'll state my argument right away that mobile is taking over, and it's hard to argue against this statement, but obviously there might be some skeptics in the room. And I'd like to actually just show you the data, and hopefully it will convince you to some extent. So, yes, you can see it pretty well. So, this for the past 5 years, since 2014, without even looking at the legend at the bottom, you can potentially figure out what line represents what. And if you look closer, the top one would be the mobile, and the bottom one is a desktop. You can see how steep the growth of mobile devices. This is, by the way, market share of mobile devices versus desktop devices, and how big the growth we had in the past 5 years. So it's fair to say, in terms of just the numbers, mobile is right now on 54%, and desktop about 46 or so on the market share. But obviously mobile is such a broad term, and I mentioned Android a couple of times, and I really like to explain why. And again, the data will help us here. In another graph, obviously. So the past 5 years, I really like that, periods, maybe because I'm Russian, the 5 years. And so just think of the top line. If you were to guess, and people would guess it's iOS, but it's actually the Android. Android is winning greatly. The market share is 76%, whereas the iOS, which is the closest competitor here, is just 18%. So there is no even competition in that regard in terms of the market share. Hence, the Android is definitely leading in that regard, and as a result, I really like to focus today on the Android. So I hope with that we kind of established why the context is on mobile and with focus on Android today. But the second part is obviously the testing piece. And if you, have an application, you really think of how do I test it. Obviously, what comes into mind is the test pyramid, which is, everyone knows about it. You start with unit tests, and you're trying to keep the highest number of those in place, which obviously the least cost in terms of maintenance. They're the fastest, but they give you a very low level of fidelity. In simpler terms, the confidence you have in the quality of your product is very minimal on that level. And obviously you go towards integration tests, where you have multiple units of work tested, and ultimately you end up with end-to-end tests, hopefully with the fewest number of those. Because the cost of those tests is the highest in terms of development, maintenance. They are pretty slow, but the best part, of course, that the confidence you have in your app is the highest on that level, because it's actual use cases you're trying to test. So that's obviously a very simple concept that everyone uses. But in regards to the Android, and since I mentioned we're going to focus on Android today, I will be focusing on end-to-end, so I'll just briefly say what would stay on those bottom levels, the unit and integration layers. So in terms of the unit testing, obviously what comes to mind is the espresso tests, which basically don't even make you to have the device in place. You can just write the unit tests on your desktop and run them without any emulators or real devices. But when you go to integration tests for mobile, what comes to mind is the instrumentation tests, and here you actually have to have a real device. So it's a little bit slower, but still it's a low-level tests, so they usually get run faster than the end-to-end tests, which we'll obviously focus on today, and I'll talk about them in more details. And we'll still stick to those rules of the highest cost, the lowest speed, and the highest fidelity of the tests in regards to the end-to-end, even for mobile. So with that kind of out of the way, we actually get to the main part of the talk. And obviously, whenever you think of end-to-end or even unit testing or integration testing for that matter, there are obviously lots of different solutions in place. And there is a Calabash, there is a Keep It Functional framework, there's obviously the UI Automator, the Monkey Talk, and a lot of other ones. I want to be clear, we're not going to talk about any of those. The ones we will talk about would be, as I mentioned, the Robotium, Appium, and something in the middle that I'll explain in a second. But the whole point of today's talk, I'm really like to take you guys on a journey of the Android end-to-end automation. And we'll start our journey by talking about Robotium, as I mentioned. Then there's something in between called Cell Android, which I'll try to explain in a couple of slides at least. And we'll end up using Appium. And this is where our journey will end, hopefully. So again, I really like that conceptual mapping that we will be using as an agenda today. So again, as I mentioned, we'll start with Robotium, go to the Cell Android, and end up in Appium. Okay, so let me see, we're good. All right, so let's get started with the first step, and first step is obviously the Robotium. In terms of the architecture, I'm horrible at drawing. So this is a device. You can think of the architecture, obviously it all starts with a device or an emulator or simulator, or whatever you choose to have. Then you have your app, whether it's with Robotium, it's mostly the activity that you target. Then you would basically attach the test runner. I usually use the Android JUnit runner for that purpose. And at the end of the schema, you would basically have the actual test case. But the thing is, it all lives together in the same code base as your main core application. And I'll show you to you in a second as an example in actual code. So in terms of just summary of that architecture and what it actually means to us, the Robotium is the really Android-oriented framework. As I've mentioned, the test will exist in the same modules as your production code. Obviously, they will be in the testing part of it, but still they will be residing in the same main core module of the app. People call Robotium black box testing. I don't necessarily agree with that, but what I agree with is that it's really user-centric testing, where they've done a very good job with encapsulating and abstracting the APIs, where you don't talk about interactions like with Selenium, where you would say send keys, press the button. Instead, they really focus on encapsulating and calling it like unlock the screen, swipe left, right. So I really like the encapsulation there. So they're really like user-centric and task-oriented. And obviously that ends up limiting the verbosity of this framework, which is usually a complaint about Java, to be way too verbose. So whenever there is help in that regard, it's always good to have. So in terms of the examples, if you imagine, so this use case, by the way, I brought mostly from the official Robotium website, a little bit trimmed version, so you can always take a look. But the idea, imagine you have a Notepad application with two main activities, the note list and note editor. Regardless of what they do, they extend the activity. That's the only thing you need to know. And imagine you start to write a test for this application. So obviously, as I've mentioned, you have to define your runner on the top, the JUnit 4. Then you name your class, you create a rule. An important part here is that you have to bind the rule to the activity under test, the notes list, as you see in the line. The last line is the name of the activities I showed before. Then, an important part. You don't have to memorize it or even write it down, obviously. The whole point I'm trying to highlight here is the solo. That class called solo here. It's basically, think of it, if you ever used Selenium before, you can see the direct correlation that it's basically a wrapper around API that allows you to interact with the activity. So it's very similar in the way you instantiate it, as you see in the setup or even in the tear down, you basically get rid of it, and in the setup you connect it to the activity. When you actually write the test itself, imagine you already instantiated your solo object. It's fairly simple. As I've mentioned, the API is quite nice. So you just unlock the screen using this solo object. then you say, find the one thing I want to focus on is the Solo get view, the RID. That's actually an important highlight and why I've mentioned these tests have to reside in the same module as the production code. Because Robotium, it's really focusing on the Android developers. Because these are the references to the IDs of your individual web elements on the Android app. It's different from what you would use in the Selenium when there are selectors. Here you're really accessing the low-level references. So here you have to be background Android developer for the most part. So this is something I'd like to highlight. And obviously there are special assert logic where you just basically say, I have to be on this activity I expect to be after I click the button. So this is basically Robotium in a nutshell. The overall to take away from here is that it's really focusing on the Android developers. It's very still the way you write tests similar to how you would do it for the Selenium in terms of the instantiating the Solo class, the same way you would do for the WebDriver. And but the overall logic is fairly similar. Going to the Selendroid. Selendroid is quite different though from the Robotium. The reason why I'm saying that is architecture-wise, and even the name suggests that it's the first part, Selen, it's because it's based on Selenium. So behind it will be the WebDriver client, which also helps you with the language bindings. And obviously the last part of the droid is the fact that it's for Android. So obviously it has its own drivers for the Selendroid, and ultimately similar to how the Selenium WebDriver would look like, you have the bindings to the app under test as well. So that's basically the gist of it. If you've ever seen the diagram for the WebDriver, it would be very similar to this. This is from the Selendroid.io, so you can always go for the reference to their website. So in regards to just the highlights, obviously as I mentioned, it's Selenium-based test framework. So the good part, comparing especially to the Robotium, is that here we're really going towards kind of scaling up our test framework, because now you can run your tests for multiple devices in parallel, which again is important for end-to-end testing. They have a quite nice gesture support, which I'll compare to other frameworks, but it's always nice to acknowledge that. Selendroid is quite good for support of older Android APIs, which would make sense when I get to the Appium and why it matters to acknowledge it here as well. But in regards to the example, imagine you have an app, which basically the registration page with the username, the password, and when you enter the username, it would show up as a label on the top. So you know what you just typed, without even clicking the register. I don't know why, but imagine that's the use case. So, you're trying to write a test now. Again, this one, because it's based on Selenium, it doesn't have to reside in the same code base, the same module as your production code. So you have that completely different from the Robotium. If you've ever written the Selenium WebDriver tests for web applications, you can again see your good old WebDriver, but when you initialize it, you use something called Selendroid driver. And you connect it to the Android, and you have the same teardown logic. Obviously, because it's a WebDriver interface, the same API applies, the quit, the get, and find elements. And if you were to write the actual tests, imagine a scenario I want to test that, as I've shown you, you type the name, the username into the username field, and it should show up as a label on the top of your app. So here, I obviously set up the use case, the data. So my username would be Dmitry@gmail.com. Then what I would do is similar how I would act in the web application context. I would try to get to my activity the same way I would get to the URL in the web app context. Then I would, again, the same API, I would do find element by ID. You can do by name, by text fields. You can do all of those. So it's very similar to the Selenium. That's what I'm trying to show you. Not the overall logic here, but the fact it's everything you know about Selenium WebDriver is applicable here. And obviously you do the assertion, whatever you use, GUnit or testng. So that's basically the Selendroid in a nutshell. The similarity with Selenium is what I tried to highlight here. But if you were to compare the two, the Robotium and Selendroid, and obviously the first category that comes to mind is the architecture. As I've mentioned, the Robotium really trying to target a certain activity. Some people even call it the test automation for the activities, like the regression suite for the activities themselves. The Selendroid, you can test the entire app regardless of the individual underlying logic, like the Robotium would have to access the references. Here you access the selectors of your app. The locator strategy, obviously something that comes to mind when you compare the two. It's the idea that Robotium has to use references, and Selendroid can use Selenium locators, by ID, by name, by text fields, or whatever you desire to use. And obviously the gesture support that I've mentioned, Robotium actually has quite an extensive. Of course, as I've mentioned, if anything, Robotium is great on providing you with a great API, great abstractions that allows you to write quick tests. Selendroid has quite a limited gesture support, like just tap, double tap. But if you were to move forward from the Selendroid to the Appium as the end of our journey, and Appium, I honestly, the architecture diagram here, I'm actually loving it quite a bit because it's very different from the Selendroid to some extent. Of course, it's still based on Selenium to some extent, so it also has the Appium client, it has the Appium server it talks to, which is not something that I'm extremely interested in. Something you have to take away, of course, is that language bindings can be C#, Java, Python, whatever you prefer. But this last part is really something impressive, is that the native libraries, the way they're able to handle with Appium the multiple platforms, whether it's iOS, Android, or like Windows phones, it's that under the hood, they're able to encapsulate the other frameworks. For example, for older API versions of Android, Appium will just switch to Selendroid. If it's running the same tests you wrote in Appium on iOS devices, under the hood it switches to use, I believe, the UI automation framework. So that part is, to me, the most impressive, that they encapsulate all that complexity. So if anything changes on the platform level, they will handle it. The Appium guys will handle it. That's an impressive part. And obviously there is an app at the end of this diagram that it has to work with. So Appium, I'll approach the top points by talking about the 4 pillars of Appium that they usually advertise quite a bit. It's the idea that they're really trying to test the application as if it was production ready. So they're testing whatever goes to the marketplace, basically the APK or whatever packages you ship to the Google Play or Apple Store. So this is what you're testing, the production-ready software. The idea of loose coupling, if you're working in the software design, you always try to adhere to these two main principles, high cohesion and low loose coupling. The terminology might be complex, but the loose coupling, the idea is you're not bound. Nobody forces you to use Java or C#. You can choose whatever language you'd like. Which means you have a loose binding, loose ties to that language. At the same time, you have a loose ties to the platform you're working with. You're not forced to work with iOS or Android. You can do whatever. This is what Appium stands for. Platform agnostic, language agnostic. That's the great part about Appium. It's really standards driven. If anything, we all know that WebDriver, Selenium is a standard for web. There's no question about it. And obviously Appium is as open source as it gets. Robotium, even though it's open source, the record and play functionality, which is a plugin you can install to your IDE, that's a paid plugin. Versus record and play in Appium, which is, I believe, Appium for desktop, you can use, that one is obviously free. It's an open source. So it's open source all the way. That's a great part about Appium. In terms of the example, it's exactly like the Selendroid, except one small part. So the same use case, label, username. The setup, it's something I'd like to highlight. So again, you have your WebDriver, you initialize it as Appium driver, the URL. It's the capabilities that interest us the most. The idea that Selendroid was focused on Android, so there wasn't much to do. You just always run it for Android or the web application, you can also do that. But with Appium, as I mentioned, because it's platform agnostic, you have to specify capabilities of what platform you're targeting, what version of the platform you're targeting. In this scenario, I do Android emulator of certain version I specified here. If I want to do iOS, I would also specify it in capabilities. Obviously, they're evolving the API, but that's the main difference between Appium and Selendroid in terms of the testing. They're writing the actual code. So you can see the back compatibility is quite a good one. And obviously, the test itself is the same. The username, the find elements by ID, and the assertion. So nothing new here, we don't have to talk about it anymore. But the gist is, it's the capabilities part that really interesting and quite a strong feature of Appium. But if you were to compare the two, Cylindroid and Appium, obviously there are differences. And one that comes to mind is the platform, Android for Cylindroid, and you can say any, it's hard to say that, but yes, any platforms at that point for Appium. Android APIs, versions, obviously Cylindroid would handle all of those. The Appium would use post API 16, and if anything before that, it will just switch to Cylindroid. And there is some capabilities of advanced web testing that Cylindroid has limits on, and Appium is quite extensive, like a user agent testing. So I would like to really highlight the fact that you have to use the right tool for the right problem, and the thing you have to avoid the most is you have to avoid mixing the tools. That's the worst thing you can do. I mean, obviously not having any automation is the worst thing you can do, but mixing them up is even worse than that. And the reason why I say that, because you don't have domain-driven design, which might be a complex concept, but the idea is by having the mix-up test tools, you really increase the complexity. If you're trying to onboard someone, you have to explain them different frameworks you use. You want to avoid that. You don't have a common language to communicate between testers even. I'm not even saying about talking to the developers about your automation. So you're really getting yourself in the hole for no reason. The question is, how do I choose the framework? The GitHub is usually a great place to start. People usually say stars is a good point of reference. Robotium, for example, has about 2,000. Appium has over 7,000. But something I like to look at is the last commit date. Robotium, nobody made any changes for the past 2 years. Appium, just a week ago, I think someone made a change there. So that one is actively evolving framework, Appium, of course. Twitter activity is also a good reference. Robotium, again, 2 years, no activity. Appium is obviously just blowing up, especially with the Appium conference recently. The external integrations, the fact that enterprise acknowledges the framework, like ApplyTools develops the ICE API for Appium, really shows that enterprise acknowledges the framework and it's there to stay. And really try to do proof of concepts. Try to experiment with different frameworks and try out whatever works best for you. But more importantly, it's all about the flexibility and the use case that you're in. When it comes to flexibility, obviously you have to think of the cost of transition. Transitioning from Cylindroid to Appium, as you saw, quite simple, but Robotium to the Appium can be quite challenging. So if you know you're going to develop multi-platform application, go with Appium right away. But Instagram famously has been an iPhone-only app for 4 years. So you might be just existing in a single platform and don't even invest into this multi-platform app test frameworks at all. Obviously, you have to think about the return of investment whenever you do anything with a software. Ability to customize your software and replace, again, going from Cylindroid to Appium is fairly simple. But more importantly is its use case that you're in. Again, Android is leading, as I showed you, in the market share, but when it comes to the revenue, they looked at from the app stores. In 2016, it was twice as much money they've made in the Apple App Store versus the Google Play Store. So really, it's, whenever it comes to metrics, you have to acknowledge that as well. So it's really about your use case. And you have to think about the team expertise. As I've mentioned, if your developers and testers are Android developers in the past, maybe Robotium will be good for them because they have to write references to the from the Android selectors. If they are web testers, probably the Selenium-based automation framework would be the best reference for them, Appium or Cylindroid. Application framework, if you are Android-based, maybe Robotium is a good choice. If you're iOS, you have to go with something else. And obviously, last but not least, is the idea if your infrastructure can even support that. Like if you have an ability to run multi-device testing in the cloud, can you even support that now? If you cannot, maybe you should invest time into that instead. So I would like to wrap this all up with just a call for an action. Really evaluate your test architecture. Think of your strategy. If you have a mix-up of tools, get rid of that, just go for one. But be able to adapt for the change really quickly if you can. So always have an expiration date on any software you use, any pattern you deploy. And experiment. Do those, proof of concept. If you've been in this conference, you heard about some interesting framework, try it first for an hour or something, time box it, and try to implement, show the benefit. So that's basically the call for an action, and I really thank you guys for joining, and with that we'll go to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Actually, like if you have to automate something like Chrome OS or Chromebook, which one will you choose, like Appium or Robotium?
Sorry, when you say automate the Chromebook, you mean is it a desktop app or is it a web app, or like what are you referring to exactly?
It's maybe you can take web app.
Web app. I mean, it depends, right? I would say if it's a web app, it's a good question. I would honestly, like especially if it's a responsive app or a hybrid app, I would honestly go for the Appium. I like to have mix with the Appium and the Selenium test. Selenium, for the sake of testing the best thing to test with Selenium for that use case is basically the moment where app changes from desktop to tablet, from tablet to phone. In that range is usually when lots of visual bugs slip in. So I like to have some coverage there using just regular Selenium WebDriver. But when it comes to testing your app, the main use cases, I like to use Appium. So I would say Appium would be the one I would go for the web app testing. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but basically, to summarize, Appium is for core use cases. The Selenium WebDriver that you would write separately from Appium would be for those edge casing when the platforms change from desktop, tablet to the phone. Because in the range in between, you have lots of visual bugs, like the colors slip in, the font is different, the things overlap. That's something you would really test and use Selenium for. So that's the gist of it. But you wouldn't use Robotium for that.
One more question. Let's say like we have a device which has like insane amounts of APK, like 1,000 APKs. One APK for login, then one APK when you get into the main screen, then the next screen. Like so, if you have like insane amount of APKs in one particular device, so do you think Appium or Selenium, which would be the Selendroid, which would be the good one?
I'm really biased when it comes to testing, honestly. At this point, there is no question what you should go for. I would always go for Appium. Like, Selendroid is great, but Appium has a lot more functionalities, because again, if you're already writing Selendroid, there is no reason to stay there. Appium allows you to go and test other platforms. The question is, Robotium or Appium? Robotium, again, is kind of dead for 2 years now. And it's only Android, it's very limited, so I wouldn't really go for that. So Appium is your best choice. As I mentioned, it's going to be a standard if it's not yet. So.
Hello, thank you for the talk.
Thank you.
What about your speed of Appium tests? As I know, it's one of the most popular concern of this framework, because it's using a WebDriver to connect to another driver, and only after that to the application. So do you have these issues, and if you have, how you handle it?
Yeah, I know. That's a that's a common complaint. This is why, that's actually something they say about why Robotium is great, is because it's quite fast, because it's really focusing on this activity-based testing. I mean, I would say you always have to use those cloud providers, like don't want to give any advertisement, but there is like BrowserStack and Sauce Labs are quite good at that. The Sauce Labs has this test object. It helps you at least, shift the effort of running it locally using your resources. But yeah, that's something you have to live with, the slowness. Honestly speaking, the biggest problem with end-to-end tests, I believe Richard spoke about it, is that people really write a crazy amount of those tests. At Salesforce, I believe we are the largest users of Selenium, and it pains my heart because it's quite slow. And the problem is developers, if you have slow tests, developers don't use them on day-to-day, because it's all about the feedback when it comes to testing. So honestly, I don't want to say that, but I haven't run any tests, any end-to-end tests in a while, I would say. I only run mostly unit tests lately and integration tests, because I don't like slowness. It's just awful. So you have to stick to that, unfortunately. But again, respect the pyramid, okay? Respect that. Thank you.